February 16th, 1991. Southern Iraq. Sergeant Khalid Hassan crouched in his bunker, one of hundreds of defensive positions the Iraqi Republican Guard Tawakalna mechanized division had constructed over the previous weeks. The division, approximately 15,000 personnel with several hundred armored vehicles and artillery pieces, held defensive lines north of the Kuwaiti border, positioned to counter any coalition ground offensive. Sergeant Hassan had served throughout the Iran-Iraq War. He was a veteran, experienced with combat, and familiar with airstrikes from 8 years of conflict with Iranian forces. The coalition air campaign had been ongoing for 30 days, and Hassan had witnessed numerous strikes. F-16s conducting precision attacks, A-10s engaging armor with their distinctive cannon fire, F-A-18s striking command posts. The attacks were constant, but dispersed positions like the Tawakalna division occupied survived better than concentrated forces. Hardened bunkers provided protection. Dispersal meant that strikes on one position didn't affect adjacent positions. The defensive network was designed for survivability. At approximately 14:45 hours, Sergeant Hassan was eating a meal, believing himself reasonably safe. The bunker was well constructed, reinforced with sandbags and concrete. The entrance was baffled to prevent blast effects from entering directly. The position had survived previous airstrikes nearby. Hassan had no reason to expect this afternoon would be different from previous days. 35,000 feet overhead, completely invisible to Sergeant Hassan and his unit, a B-52G Stratofortress, designated Olive 41, cruised at approximately 450 knots. The aircraft had launched from Diego Garcia 12 hours earlier, refueled 3 times from KC-135 tankers, and was approaching its assigned target area in southern Iraq. The crew consisted of 5 personnel: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radar navigator, and electronic warfare officer. They had been briefed on their target, a grid square containing Republican Guard defensive positions that coalition planners wanted neutralized before ground operations commenced. The navigator, Captain James Sullivan, worked with the radar navigator to update the aircraft's position using GPS signals from the constellation of satellites overhead. The precision was extraordinary compared to navigation methods used during the B-52's earlier combat deployments. In Vietnam, B-52 navigation had relied on ground-based radio navigation systems and radar bombing. By 1991, GPS provided positional accuracy within meters, enabling precision that transformed the B-52 from an area bomber into a platform capable of engaging specific targets. The radar navigator computed the weapon release point based on current position, target coordinates, winds aloft, aircraft altitude and speed, and the ballistic characteristics of the weapons being carried. The aircraft carried 51 Mk-117 750-pound general-purpose bombs, some equipped with GPS guidance kits that would enable them to adjust their trajectory during the fall to impact precise aim points rather than simply falling ballistically. At the computed release point, the weapons bay doors opened. The bombs released in sequence, spaced to provide coverage across the target area. Each weapon began its 90-second fall from 35,000 feet, accelerating under gravity, air resistance slowing the fall somewhat, but momentum carrying each bomb toward the impact point, calculated by the aircraft's computers. Sergeant Hassan's first indication something was wrong came when he heard a distinctive whistling sound growing rapidly louder. For a fraction of a second, he processed the sound, recognizing it as falling ordnance, but confused about where it was coming from. There had been no air raid warning. He hadn't heard aircraft engines. He hadn't seen anything unusual. The first impact occurred approximately 50 meters from Hassan's bunker. The explosion was massive, the 750-pound bomb detonating with blast and fragmentation that would kill or wound anyone within 75 meters without protection. Hassan was inside his bunker, protected from the initial blast, but the concussion was severe enough to collapse one wall partially and shower the interior with dust and debris. Within the next 90 seconds, 50 more bombs impacted across the area. The pattern was systematic, covering approximately 1 square kilometer with precision strikes that destroyed or damaged bunkers, weapons positions, vehicles, and supplies throughout the target grid. Hassan survived because his specific bunker location didn't receive a direct hit, but the devastation around him was comprehensive. When the impacts ceased, Hassan emerged cautiously from his bunker. The landscape had been transformed. Craters marked where bombs had impacted. Smoke rose from multiple locations. Several bunkers had collapsed completely. Vehicles were damaged or destroyed. Personnel who had been outside during the strike were casualties. The survivors were shaken, disoriented, trying to understand what had happened. Hassan looked up, searching the sky for the aircraft that had conducted the strike. The sky was partially clouded, but visibility was reasonable. He saw nothing. No aircraft, no contrails, no sign of any air activity. He scanned the horizon in all directions, listening carefully for engine sounds. Nothing. Whatever had struck them had done so from such altitude or distance that it remained completely undetected even after the attack. The radio reports from his position and dozens of others struck that afternoon reflected confusion and fear. Attacked by invisible aircraft, no warning, no sound, ordnance struck from the sky. We saw nothing. How do we defend against this? Days later, when coalition ground forces advanced into southern Iraq, they encountered Iraqi soldiers from units that had been subjected to B-52 strikes. The psychological impact was evident in how they described their experience. One Iraqi soldier, captured by the US 1st Infantry Division, described it to his interrogators. "Your aircraft fly so high we cannot see them. They make no sound we can hear before the bombs arrive. They strike day and night. We have no defense. How do we fight an enemy we cannot detect?" The B-52's ability to operate above effective Iraqi air defense ranges while delivering precision ordnance transformed strategic bombing during Desert Storm. But understanding this required examining Iraqi air defense capabilities and why they proved inadequate against high-altitude operations. The Iraqi air defense network before Desert Storm represented one of the world's most extensive integrated systems outside the Warsaw Pact. Years of arms purchases from the Soviet Union and construction of defensive infrastructure had created layered coverage designed to engage aircraft at all altitudes and ranges. Surface-to-air missile coverage included multiple Soviet-designed systems positioned throughout Iraq. The SA-2 guideline, the backbone of Iraqi high-altitude coverage, had a theoretical ceiling of approximately 60,000 feet, though realistic engagement ceiling was closer to 50,000 feet against non-maneuvering targets. Iraq possessed approximately 350 SA-2 launchers distributed across the country, concentrated around strategic targets like Baghdad, Basra, and military installations. The SA-3 Goa provided medium-altitude coverage with approximately 40,000 feet ceiling. Iraq operated approximately 200 SA-3 launchers. The SA-6 Gainful, a mobile system, covered medium altitudes with approximately 45,000 feet ceiling and 200 launchers deployed. Lower altitude coverage came from SA-8, SA-9, and SA-13 systems, plus hundreds of shoulder-fired SA-7 and SA-14 missiles. The total inventory exceeded 850 SAM launchers, with thousands of missiles available for employment. Anti-aircraft artillery complemented missile coverage. The ZSU-23-4 Shilka, a radar-guided mobile system with 4 23mm cannons, provided coverage against low-flying aircraft. Towed systems included S-60 57mm guns and KS-19 100mm guns. The Iraqi inventory included thousands of A-A pieces, ranging from small-caliber weapons to large guns capable of engaging medium-altitude targets. But 808 was fundamentally limited to altitudes below approximately 20,000 feet. Above that altitude, trajectory computations became impractical, and time of flight made hitting maneuvering targets nearly impossible. Fighter coverage theoretically provided mobile defensive capability. Iraq possessed MiG-21, MiG-23, MiG-25, and MiG-29 interceptors, several hundred aircraft capable of high-altitude operations. The MiG-25 Foxbat specifically was designed for high-altitude interception, with service ceiling exceeding 70,000 feet and radar capable of detecting large targets at substantial ranges. In theory, MiG-25s could intercept B-52s operating at 35,000 to 40,000 feet. Iraqi air defense doctrine followed Soviet models, emphasizing layered defense. SAM systems would engage high-altitude threats. AAA would engage low-altitude aircraft. Fighters provided mobile response, intercepting aircraft that penetrated fixed defenses. Ground control intercept centers coordinated the network, directing fighters and providing early warning for SAM sites. The integration was sophisticated, refined through years of operational experience during the Iran-Iraq War. Iraqi confidence in their air defense capability was based on substantial experience. Throughout the 8-year Iran-Iraq War, the integrated network had defended against Iranian airstrikes conducted by F-4 Phantoms, F-5 Tigers, and F-14 Tomcats. While Iranian aircraft achieved some successes, Iraqi air defenses had engaged them effectively enough to prevent decisive air operations. The experience suggested that the network could contest airspace against modern aircraft when properly employed. Soviet training and equipment created additional confidence. Soviet advisors had helped design the Iraqi network, positioning radar sites for optimal coverage, integrating systems to provide redundancy, training operators in procedures proven during Soviet air defense operations. The equipment was current by Soviet standards, comparable to what Warsaw Pact forces operated. Iraqi planners believed they possessed a world-class air defense capability. The specific threat assessment regarding B-52s was based on available intelligence and Soviet guidance. Iraqi intelligence knew that B-52s had deployed to the region and would likely conduct strikes against Iraqi forces. The standard defensive response was to employ SA-2 missiles against high-altitude targets. Soviet advisors assured Iraqi counterparts that SA-2 systems could engage B-52s effectively within their engagement envelope. Historical precedent from the Vietnam War informed Iraqi expectations. North Vietnam had engaged B-52s with SA-2 missiles throughout Operations Linebacker Fur and the Sentinel, achieving 15 confirmed losses of B-52s to SAMs. While this represented a small percentage of total B-52 sorties flown over North Vietnam, it demonstrated that SA-2 systems could engage and eliminate B-52s under combat conditions. Iraqi planners expected similar success rates when their systems engaged American bombers. What Iraqi planners failed to anticipate was how extensively the B-52 had been modified since Vietnam, and how GPS-guided weapons would change high-altitude bombing effectiveness. The B-52 operating over Iraq in 1991 was fundamentally different from the aircraft North Vietnam had engaged 20 years earlier. The B-52G variant that conducted the majority of Desert Storm operations represented the culmination of decades of continuous modification and upgrade to the basic airframe that had first flown in 1952. By 1991, the aircraft bore little resemblance internally to the original design, despite the external appearance remaining recognizable. GPS integration was perhaps the most significant upgrade affecting Desert Storm operations. During the late 1980s, the Air Force integrated GPS receivers with the B-52's navigation and bombing computers. This enabled continuous precise positioning that updated the aircraft's inertial navigation system, correcting drift that accumulated over long missions. More importantly, GPS positioning enabled calculation of accurate weapon release points without requiring ground-based navigation aids or visual reference to targets. The navigator could input target coordinates received via satellite communication. The system would calculate the release point based on current aircraft position and trajectory, and weapons would release precisely at the computed point. The munitions themselves had evolved. The conventional load for Desert Storm missions typically consisted of 51 Mk-117 750-pound general-purpose bombs. The aircraft's internal bomb bay held 27 weapons. Additional pylons on the wings carried 12 bombs each on 2 pylons, totaling 24 external weapons. This gave the B-52G a total conventional ordnance capacity of approximately 38,000 pounds per sortie, though typical loads were slightly less to optimize fuel consumption for the long-range missions required. Some bombs were equipped with GPS guidance kits that converted unguided general-purpose bombs into precision weapons. The guidance kits, early predecessors to the Joint Direct Attack munition, JDAM, that would become standard decades later, added control surfaces and GPS receivers to conventional bombs. During the fall from release altitude to impact, the guidance system would adjust the bomb's trajectory to compensate for winds release errors and other factors impacting within meters of the aim point, rather than the hundreds of meters dispersion unguided bombs produced. Altitude operations were optimized through modifications to engines, aerodynamics, and systems. The B-52G's service ceiling was approximately 50,000 feet, higher than the effective engagement ceiling of most Iraqi SAM systems. Typical cruise altitude during Desert Storm missions was 35,000 to 40,000 feet, chosen to balance fuel efficiency, weapons effectiveness, and survivability. At these altitudes, the aircraft operated above most weather, provided crew safety through distance from ground-based threats, and enabled weapons to achieve optimal ballistic performance during the fall to targets. Electronic warfare capabilities had been upgraded substantially since Vietnam. The ALQ-172 electronic countermeasures suite provided jamming capability against Iraqi radar systems, degrading their ability to achieve solid tracking solutions needed for missile guidance. Chaff dispensers carried bundles of radar reflective strips that could be released to confuse radar or decoy missiles. Flare dispensers provided some capability against heat-seeking missiles, though the primary threat to B-52s was radar-guided SAMs rather than infrared systems. The crew complement was 5 personnel positioned in 2 separate compartments. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the forward upper deck with traditional cockpit instrumentation and controls. The navigator, radar navigator, and electronic warfare officer occupied the lower deck in a compartment filled with navigation, bombing, and defensive systems, displays, and controls. The crew compartments were separated by the weapons bay, meaning that 3 crew members couldn't reach the pilots without exiting the aircraft. This arrangement, a holdover from the B-52's strategic nuclear mission, where crew needed to operate independently if the aircraft was damaged, created communication challenges but enabled each position to focus on specific duties without distraction. All crew positions required extensive training. Pilots needed proficiency in formation flight, aerial refueling, high-altitude operations, and emergency procedures specific to the 8-engine platform. Navigators trained extensively on GPS operations, coordinate systems, mission planning, and communication procedures. Radar navigators operated the bombing computers, calculated release points, and coordinated weapons employment. Electronic warfare officers managed defensive systems, monitored threat indicators, and employed countermeasures when Iraqi radar systems attempted to track the aircraft. Mission profiles during Desert Storm often involved 14-hour flights from Diego Garcia, the British territory in the Indian Ocean, approximately 3,800 miles from Iraq. Missions from this distant base required multiple aerial refuelings, typically 3 to 4 during each sortie. KC-135 Stratotankers and KC-10 extenders provided fuel during transit to target areas, during the return flight, and sometimes during operations over Iraq, if the mission duration required additional fuel beyond what the B-52's tanks could carry. Formation flying was standard procedure. B-52s typically operated in cells of 2 or 3 aircraft, maintaining formation throughout the mission except during weapons release. Formation operations provided mutual electronic warfare support, with each aircraft's jammers creating overlapping coverage that complicated Iraqi radar tracking. Formation also enabled lead navigators to provide guidance for following aircraft, reducing workload on individual crews during long missions. The development history of the B-52 illustrated how continuous upgrades could maintain relevance for airframes designed decades earlier. The B-52 first flew in 1952, making the airframe 39 years old by Desert Storm. No other combat aircraft had remained in frontline service for nearly 4 decades. But continuous upgrades to avionics, weapons systems, engines, and survivability equipment had kept the platform effective against evolving threats. The massive airframe, designed originally to deliver nuclear weapons over intercontinental ranges, proved adaptable to conventional bombing missions when strategic requirements changed. Cost effectiveness remained reasonable despite the platform's age. The B-52G cost approximately $30,000 per flight hour to operate in 1990. Expensive by most standards, but justified by the ordnance delivery capacity. Each sortie delivered approximately 25 tons of ordnance, creating efficiency that smaller tactical aircraft couldn't match. 10 B-52 sorties delivered approximately 250 tons, requiring perhaps 150 tactical aircraft sorties to deliver equivalent tonnage. The sortie rate advantage favored distributed tactical operations for some missions, but for sustained bombardment of area targets, B-52 efficiency was unmatched. When Desert Storm commenced on January 17, 1991, 74 B-52G aircraft had deployed to bases within range of Iraq, supported by aerial refueling infrastructure that enabled operations from even more distant locations. The employment of these aircraft over the 43 days of the air campaign demonstrated capabilities Iraqi forces couldn't counter effectively. The initial deployment positioned B-52s at multiple locations to provide operational flexibility. Diego Garcia, despite its distance from Iraq, remained the primary operating base for approximately half the B-52 force. The secure location, beyond any possible Iraqi retaliation, enabled sustained operations without force protection concerns. Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, hosted additional aircraft closer to target areas, reducing flight time and tanker requirements. Moron Air Base in Spain provided a forward location for aircraft conducting strikes into western Iraq. The dispersed basing complicated Iraqi intelligence efforts to predict strike timing based on takeoff observations. Mission types divided between strategic strikes and arc-light operations supporting ground forces. Strategic strikes targeted fixed installations, communications facilities, command centers, weapons production facilities, strategic bridges, airfields, objectives that required destruction or significant damage rather than simply suppression. Arc-light missions, named after the Rolling Thunder era operation in Vietnam, delivered concentrated ordnance on Iraqi ground forces, particularly Republican Guard units and defensive positions along the Kuwaiti border. The opening phase of the air campaign from January 17 through February 23 emphasized strategic targets. B-52s struck Iraqi air bases, cratering runways and damaging support facilities. They engaged command centers and communications nodes that Iraqi military leadership required for coordinating defensive operations. They struck infrastructure, including bridges, power stations, and transportation hubs that supported Iraqi military logistics. The strategic campaign aimed to degrade Iraqi war-making capacity before ground operations commenced. Specific examples illustrated the B-52's role during the campaign. Republican Guard divisions positioned in southern Iraq and Kuwait received systematic ordnance delivery across division-sized areas, typically several square kilometers. The strikes weren't attempting to destroy every vehicle or eliminate every soldier. The objective was degrading combat effectiveness through equipment destruction, supply disruption, and psychological impact. Intelligence assessments suggested that Republican Guard units lost 30 to 50% of their heavy equipment before the ground war began, with significant portions of those losses attributable to B-52 strikes. Logistics facilities throughout Iraq received attention from B-52 missions. Supply depots storing ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and other materiel supporting Iraqi forces were engaged with ordnance loads designed to create fires and secondary explosions. Vehicle parks concentrating Iraqi transportation assets were struck, destroying trucks and reducing Iraqi capability to move supplies or reposition forces. The systematic targeting of logistics degraded Iraqi military sustainability even where frontline combat units survived largely intact. The Basra rail yards, a critical logistics hub for Iraqi forces in Kuwait, received multiple B-52 strikes during the campaign. The rail infrastructure enabled movement of heavy equipment and bulk supplies from Iraq proper into Kuwait, supporting the occupation force. B-52 strikes cratered rail lines, destroyed loading facilities, and disabled rolling stock. The damage interdicted Iraqi logistics flow, forcing reliance on less efficient road transportation that coalition air power could attack more easily. The battlefield preparation phase from February 24 through February 28 saw B-52 employment shift toward direct support of the ground offensive. As coalition ground forces crossed into Iraq and Kuwait, B-52s struck Iraqi defensive positions immediately ahead of advancing units. The timing was carefully coordinated. Ground forces would halt advance several kilometers short of Iraqi positions. B-52s would strike the defensive lines with concentrated ordnance. Ground forces would advance through positions stunned by the bombardment, encountering disorganized resistance from defenders who had just survived massive strikes. The sortie statistics documented the scale of B-52 operations during Desert Storm. 1,624 B-52 sorties over 43 days represented approximately 38 sorties daily, sustained throughout the campaign. The tonnage delivered totaled 25,700 tons, approximately 27% of coalition total bomb tonnage, despite B-52s representing a small fraction of total coalition aircraft. The average sortie delivered approximately 15,800 pounds of ordnance, reflecting the typical combat load of 51 bombs weighing 750 pounds each. Iraqi air defense response to B-52 operations revealed the limitations of their systems against high-altitude platforms. SA-2 operators attempted to engage B-52s when they detected them on radar, but the engagement geometry created problems. B-52s operating at 35,000 to 40,000 feet were near or above the SA-2's effective engagement ceiling. Missiles launched at maximum range often exploded below the target, with proximity fuses detonating when tracking was lost or when warheads passed maximum altitude. Some engagements resulted in missiles exploding 10,000 feet or more below B-52s, visible to the aircrew but representing no actual threat. Fighter intercepts were attempted but prevented by coalition air superiority. Iraqi MiG-25s theoretically could have intercepted B-52s at altitude, but coalition F-15C fighters established combat air patrols that engaged Iraqi fighters before they reached bomber formations. The few Iraqi fighters that attempted intercepts during the early days of the campaign were engaged by F-15s, with none successfully reaching B-52 formations. Iraqi operators learned quickly that activating SAM radars invited harm missile strikes from coalition aircraft conducting suppression of enemy air defenses missions. The choice became stark. Activate radar to attempt engaging B-52s, risking harm strikes that would destroy the SAM system, or keep radars offline to survive but provide no coverage. Most operators chose survival, leaving B-52s to operate without effective SAM opposition throughout most of the campaign. The effectiveness of B-52 strikes was documented through multiple sources. Iraqi ground forces consistently identified B-52 strikes as among the most feared aspects of coalition air operations. Post-war interviews with captured Iraqi soldiers revealed that the psychological impact of strikes arriving without warning was severe. Knowing that ordnance could arrive at any time, day or night, without any indication beforehand, created stress that degraded unit cohesion and morale. The physical damage was extensive. Republican Guard units that entered Kuwait with full equipment strength were assessed at 30 to 50% capability by the time ground operations commenced. Tank battalions reported only half their authorized vehicles operational. Artillery batteries had lost significant numbers of guns to strikes. Personnel casualties from B-52 strikes were substantial, though exact numbers remained difficult to assess. Iraqi units reported difficulty maintaining defensive positions when they knew that B-52 strikes could arrive without warning. The arc-light strike pattern was designed for systematic coverage of target areas. A 3-aircraft cell releasing ordnance in sequence could cover an area approximately 1 kilometer by half a kilometer, with bombs spaced to provide overlapping effects. Multiple cells striking the same area created comprehensive coverage that few military positions could survive undamaged. The pattern was refined from Vietnam experience, adapted to GPS-enabled precision that improved accuracy significantly compared to earlier operations. Crew perspectives on Desert Storm missions reflected professionalism and confidence in their systems. One B-52 pilot described a typical mission. "We flew 14-hour missions from Diego Garcia to Iraq and back. We dropped 51 bombs on target coordinates provided through satellite communication. We never saw the target visually. GPS and radar navigation did the work. The aircraft performed flawlessly. Iraqi SAMs occasionally launch missiles at us that we saw explode thousands of feet below. We never felt seriously threatened. The acoustic effect on Iraqi ground forces was documented in post-war interviews. Iraqi soldiers described hearing massive explosions from ordnance impacts, but never hearing the aircraft that delivered the weapons. The B-52's 8 engines at 35,000 feet didn't produce sound that reached the ground distinctly enough to provide warning. By the time ordnance impact sounds reached Iraqi positions, the aircraft had already released its weapons and was departing the area. The absence of engine noise created the impression of an invisible enemy, psychological impact that complemented the physical destruction. The GPS advantage eliminated weather as a defensive factor for Iraqi forces. During periods when cloud cover prevented visual bombing by tactical aircraft, B-52s continued operations with no degradation in accuracy. The GPS-guided weapons could be delivered through complete overcast, with munitions impacting precisely despite the aircrew never seeing the ground from release until after impact. Weather that Iraqi forces hoped would provide respite from air operations offered no protection against B-52 strikes. The relentlessness of operations created cumulative psychological impact. B-52 strikes occurred day and night, continuously throughout the campaign. Iraqi forces couldn't predict timing or location of strikes. Any position might be targeted at any time. The unpredictability prevented adaptation and created constant stress. Units couldn't rest when they never knew if the next moment would bring ordnance arriving without warning. The reasons Iraqi air defenses failed to counter B-52 operations effectively stemmed from technological, tactical, and operational factors that created decisive advantages for American forces. The altitude disadvantage was fundamental. B-52s operating at 35,000 to 40,000 feet were at or above the effective engagement ceiling of most Iraqi SAM systems. The SA-2's theoretical 60,000-foot ceiling assumed ideal conditions, target not maneuvering, radar achieving perfect track, missile performing optimally. In practice, engaging targets above 40,000 feet was difficult and often unsuccessful. The SA-3 and SA-6 systems had even lower ceilings, making them ineffective against B-52s at typical operating altitudes. GPS technology enabled precision targeting without radar emissions that Iraqi forces could detect. Earlier B-52 operations required radar bombing where the aircraft's radar illuminated the target area, creating emissions Iraqi operators could detect and potentially use for tracking. GPS-based navigation and targeting occurred through passive reception of satellite signals, creating no emissions Iraqi forces could detect. The lack of warning was absolute. From the Iraqi perspective, ordnance arrived from aircraft they had no indication were present. Electronic warfare capabilities on B-52s degraded Iraqi radar performance. The ALQ-172 ECM suite jammed Iraqi radar frequencies, making it difficult for SA-2 operators to achieve the solid tracking solutions required for effective missile guidance. When combined with chaff deployment that created false radar returns, the electronic warfare environment made engaging B-52s extremely challenging, even when Iraqi operators attempted to do so. Coalition suppression of enemy air defenses using HARM missiles and fighters created impossible choices for Iraqi SAM operators. Activate radar to attempt engaging B-52s, but invite HARM strikes that would destroy the SAM system within minutes. Keep radars offline to survive, but provide no coverage against the bombers. Most operators chose survival, especially after the first weeks of the campaign demonstrated how quickly HARM missiles engaged active radar systems. The fighter gap between Iraqi and coalition air forces meant Iraqi interceptors never reached B-52 formations. Coalition F-15C fighters maintained combat air patrols that intercepted Iraqi aircraft attempting to engage bombers. The air superiority coalition forces established in the war's first week remained throughout the campaign. Iraqi fighters that attempted to intercept B-52s were engaged by F-15s before reaching the bombers, with no successful intercepts recorded during the entire campaign. The numbers overwhelmed Iraqi defensive capacity. 74 B-52s conducting approximately 38 sorties daily meant that B-52s were continuously operating somewhere over Iraq throughout each 24-hour period. Iraqi forces couldn't defend everywhere simultaneously. Concentrating defenses around specific targets left other areas vulnerable. Dispersing defenses meant each position was weak. There was no effective defensive deployment that provided adequate coverage. The attrition statistics told the story definitively. 0 B-52 losses during Desert Storm. Not a single aircraft shot down or seriously damaged by Iraqi air defenses. Compare this to the 15 B-52s lost to North Vietnamese SA-2s during Vietnam War operations, and the contrast illustrated how significantly capabilities had evolved. Iraqi air defenses, while extensive and sophisticated by regional standards, simply couldn't engage aircraft operating at the altitudes and employing the technology B-52s used during Desert Storm. The legacy of B-52 operations during Desert Storm extends beyond the immediate military results to influence strategic bombing doctrine, technology development, and force structure decisions decades later. The strategic impact demonstrated that strategic bombing remained viable against modern air defenses when conducted from sufficient altitude with appropriate technology. The pre-Desert Storm conventional wisdom suggested that large, slow-flying bombers were obsolete in the face of sophisticated integrated air defenses. Desert Storm proved this assessment wrong. When operated at appropriate altitudes, supported by electronic warfare and air superiority, and employing precision weapons that eliminated the need to overfly targets, strategic bombers could conduct sustained operations with minimal losses. Iraqi perspectives on B-52 operations were consistent across post-war interviews and captured documents. Survivors of B-52 strikes identified them as the weapon that broke us psychologically. The combination of no defense, no warning, and continuous threat created stress and demoralization that undermined unit cohesion. Iraqi soldiers reported that they feared B-52 strikes more than any other aspect of coalition air operations. The fear was irrational. B-52 strikes delivered more total ordnance than any other weapons system and struck with precision that earlier strategic bombing campaigns couldn't achieve. The modern operations context shows the B-52H continuing service in 2025, more than 70 years after the original B-52 first flew. The longevity is unprecedented in combat aviation. The continuous upgrade program that kept the platform relevant during Desert Storm continued through subsequent decades. Modern B-52Hs carry GPS-guided JDAM weapons, cruise missiles, and sensors that the 1990s crews never imagined. The basic airframe remains sound, the payload capacity remains useful, and the operational concept of standoff strike platform remains relevant. Technology evolution from Desert Storm innovations is visible in contemporary precision weapons. The GPS guidance kits used on some Desert Storm B-52 bombs were early predecessors to the Joint Direct Attack munition that became standard for American forces. JDAM transformed unguided bombs into precision weapons affordable enough for widespread use. The concept proven during Desert Storm, that GPS guidance enabled precision bombing from altitude through weather, became foundational for American air power in subsequent conflicts. Adversary adaptation to the Desert Storm experience focused on improving high-altitude air defense capability. Modern Russian S-400 systems specifically address threats from aircraft operating at B-52 altitudes, with improved radar and longer-range missiles designed to engage targets at 40,000 feet and above. Chinese air defense development followed similar priorities. The lesson adversaries drew from Desert Storm was that allowing bombers to operate unmolested at high altitude invited defeat, requiring air defense systems capable of engaging aircraft regardless of altitude. The budget efficiency argument for continued B-52 operations reflected the success of continuous upgrade over new aircraft development. Designing and producing a replacement for the B-52 would cost hundreds of billions of dollars for marginal capability improvements. Continuous upgrades to the existing fleet cost a fraction of new aircraft development while maintaining operational relevance. The decision to continue operating upgraded B-52s reflected practical assessment that the mission they performed didn't require a new airframe when the existing one remained effective. February 16, 1991. Sergeant Khalid Hassan emerged from his bunker after the strike that had devastated his unit's positions. He searched the sky for the aircraft that had attacked them. He saw nothing, heard nothing. The invisible enemy that Iraqi soldiers came to fear throughout Desert Storm had struck again, delivering precision ordnance from altitudes Iraqi air defenses couldn't reach. Iraq had prepared extensive air defense networks for aircraft they could see and engage. They deployed hundreds of SAM systems, thousands of AITA pieces, and hundreds of fighter aircraft. They trained operators using Soviet methods proven in multiple conflicts. They positioned radars for optimal coverage and integrated systems to provide redundancy. The network represented one of the world's most sophisticated air defense systems outside the Warsaw Pact. America brought aircraft that flew above Iraqi air defenses, invisible and untouchable, raining precision from the stratosphere. The B-52s that operated over Iraq during Desert Storm were fundamentally different from the aircraft that had engaged North Vietnamese forces 20 years earlier. GPS navigation enabled precision without detectable emissions. Altitude operations exceeded effective SAM engagement ranges. Electronic warfare degraded what limited Iraqi tracking capability existed. Coalition air superiority prevented fighter intercepts. The result was a strategic bombing campaign that continued day and night for 43 days, with 0 bomber losses. The 74 B-52s that participated in Desert Storm flew 1,724 sorties and delivered more than 25,700 tons of ordnance, approximately 27% of coalition total bomb tonnage. They struck from altitudes where Iraqi forces couldn't see them, couldn't hear them, and couldn't engage them effectively. They delivered ordnance with precision that earlier strategic bombing campaigns never achieved. They created psychological impact that complemented physical destruction, breaking Iraqi unit cohesion and morale through relentless strikes arriving without warning. The technology that enabled this performance, GPS navigation, precision guidance, high-altitude operations, electronic warfare, represented evolution of capabilities developed throughout the Cold War. The B-52 itself was a Cold War design, first flown when the Soviet Union was still under Stalin's rule. But continuous upgrades had transformed the platform into a weapon system effective against defenses designed specifically to counter strategic bombers. 40 years of bomber versus air defense competition had led to this outcome. Iraqi forces deployed Soviet-designed air defenses intended to counter American strategic bombers. The defenses worked reasonably well against aircraft operating within their engagement envelope. But American doctrine evolved to operate outside that envelope, employing altitudes and technologies that negated defensive advantages. The result wasn't close. It was decisive. 0 American bomber losses against the complete inability of Iraqi air defenses to prevent B-52 operations throughout the campaign. The lesson transcended the specific circumstances of Desert Storm to address broader questions about strategic bombing viability. For decades, conventional wisdom suggested that strategic bombers were obsolete, too vulnerable to modern air defenses to conduct sustained operations. Vietnam War losses seemed to confirm this assessment. B-52 losses to North Vietnamese SA-2s demonstrated that air defenses could engage and eliminate strategic bombers when they operated within defensive engagement zones. Desert Storm disproved the obsolescence argument decisively. Strategic bombers remained effective when operated appropriately, from altitudes exceeding effective SAM ranges, employing precision weapons that eliminated requirements to overfly targets, supported by electronic warfare, degrading defensive radar, protected by air superiority, preventing fighter intercepts. The platform wasn't obsolete. The employment doctrine had simply evolved to account for advanced air defenses. 70 years after the B-52 first flew, the platform remains in service, testament to design soundness and continuous upgrade effectiveness. The aircraft that struck Iraqi positions during Desert Storm are mostly retired now, replaced by later B-52H variants with improved systems. But the operational concept remains unchanged. Strategic bombing from altitude, delivering precision weapons against targets that air defenses cannot adequately protect, continues to be viable doctrine supported by platforms that trace lineage to the early Cold War. Iraq prepared for air war they understood. They deployed air defenses designed to counter aircraft operating within their engagement zones. They trained operators using Soviet doctrine proven through decades of development. They positioned systems for optimal coverage based on sound tactical principles. What they faced was an air campaign that operated outside those parameters, employing altitudes their defenses couldn't reach and technologies their doctrine didn't account for. America brought strategic bombing into the modern era through a combination of Cold War-era platforms and contemporary technology. The marriage of GPS precision with high-altitude operations and electronic warfare created capability that redefined what strategic bombing could achieve. The results during Desert Storm influenced air warfare doctrine worldwide and demonstrated that some Cold War systems remained relevant when properly evolved for contemporary challenges.